So this was just my introduction to say, even so I did my best to persuade our restorers of the importance of the presence of the Vienna St. Margaret in at least one of the venues of these Raphael exhibitions at the Prado and then at the Louvre. The painting is still on an original wooden support, but it has been considered too fragile to be moved. But it is from this that we also understand much better what an immensely important achievement it was to bring that many important works together to the Prado. And we have to thank the organizers and curators for having created such a unique opportunity for scholars. And even so, there are some more important paintings missing from the exhibition than the Vienna St. Margaret. We learn such a lot from all those that are here and from their close comparison that we will have material for discussion for at least the next 10 years. The catalogue is very scholarly, serious, dense, and requires a lot of time to read, and I only looked at some of the initial parts. There is invaluable new information on all levels, from unknown works like the tapestry with the vision of Ezekiel we have seen also in the exhibition, to novel insights in terms of meaning with regard to working procedures and most particularly illuminating results of the technical investigation. But the main task which Henry and Ioannidis felt they had to sort out was the differentiation between Raphael's own contribution in the movable paintings from about 1513 to 20 and those of his assistants, mainly Giulio and Francesco Benni. The authors seem to have had a clear goal in mind to have the pendulum swing back after late Konrad Oberhuber's extreme expansionist tendencies, which he had expressed in his exhibition Roma e lo stile classico di Raffaello of 1999, mainly with regard to Raphael's graphic output, and in the epilogue of his book on Raphael's paintings, also of 1999, in which a large part of the work attributed here to Giulio and Penny and others was considered as done largely by the master himself. We are presented with two different visions of Raphael. Henry Ioannidis see Raphael as the master of the absolute sublime. When he got overburdened with work in his later years, his interest shifted from painting to architecture and the reconstruction of Roma Antica, and he only created and executed himself very few paintings which can be distinguished by their sublime invention and execution. The vast amount of commissions are left to his assistants, first only in part of execution, then more in execution, and then also in invention. Giulio Romano paints independently from 1515 onwards and is considered the inventor and designer of works commissioned from the master. In Oberhuber's latest vision, by contrast, Raphael himself kept total control over the production of works commissioned from him. He himself would have been responsible for nearly all the inventions and the inventive drawings, and he would have delegated to assistants more of the technical work, the blowing up of the cartoons, their transfer, and preliminary phases in the execution of paintings. And here I just speak of the movable paintings. The growing demand would have accelerated Raphael's activities to such explosive spurts of invention and would have led to dramatic changes in his figural language. He would have been driven only by growing comprehension and differentiation of the multiple and diverse expressions of antique figural art, from the majestic to the aulic to the erotic, and the same holds true for his understanding of ancient architecture as part of his imaginative recreation of the past. Henry and Ioannidis find enormous differences in quality between what they assess to be Raphael's autograph handwriting and that of the assistants. In order to convince the reader of this, they set out to lay open the flaws they have detected in each work. by meticulously scrutinizing how effectively foreshortenings were rendered in difficult poses of movements, they make the reader conscious of things that until now might not have disturbed him in the painting. Since I was assigned the task to present you present to you the new underdrawings we did from the Vienna St. Margaret, which the authors consider a work by Giulio in invention and execution, I feel I should quote some of their descriptions of how they detect the hand of Giulio in commissions given to the master. I think we skip the Saint Ezekiel because we have been discussing it this morning. If you like, I will quote you on some of it, which is particularly revealing, which the awkwardness of God the Father's toes, for instance, and the weakness of the modeling in his arm and their unconvincing hinging are all found in Giulio's work. In the painting of the Visitation, they comment, and I quote, and this is Elizabeth, whose hips and legs assume an overly prominent place, is unconvincingly constructed. Her legs seem too long, her torso too short, her bottom too large, and her arms too long. With respect to the Virgin, her pose seems too clumsy, out of drawing. Her right arm is implausibly foreshortened, her left arm is awkwardly placed in space. And see, I quote, the accentuation of her breasts and nipples is characteristic of Giulio. We are made aware of deficiencies we wouldn't have considered as such. It seems that only the altarpiece of Santa Cecilia is without flaw, and therefore nearly all the others would have been executed to varying degrees by assistants. For the St. Margaret in the Louvre, the authors show nearly unconditioned praise. The figure, I quote, the figure style of the Louvre St. Margaret embodies calm and elegance. Her movement is that of a slow dance. There is no evident contrapposto. The overall impression is of gyroscopically stabilized poise. In style, she presents a further refinement of the manner established in the Santa Cecilia. The St. Margaret in Vienna, I quote, was also represented in a painting. The St. Margaret was also represented in a painting in Vienna that is surely correctly attributed entirely to Giulio Romano. It must date within about a year of the French version. Their closeness might suggest that the two were laid in simultaneously, like the pergola and the quercia, with Raphael pursuing one design while Giulio advanced the other on his own. Oh, they should come together. Oops. I'm sorry. Here. In the subsequent differentiation, the authors referred to the Louvre version as Raphael's and to the Vienna version as Giulio's. But they find no flaws, not even in the Giulio St. Margaret. The opinion that the Vienna St. Margaret goes back to, this opinion of the Vienna St. Margaret goes back to Passavant, who says of it, I quote, the deep tone in the shadows conveys the manner of treatment typical of Giulio, and also the changes done to Raphael. Raphael's composition should be attributed to him, such as the strong turning of the figure, which Raphael's sense of beauty would never have allowed. They all correspond to the ardent genius of his greatest pupil. Needless to say that Passava, writing at the time of the Nazarene movement, had a strong preference for the earlier periods. But there were also a number of other authors who voted for Raphael's responsibility in invention and execution, or at least in invention, and I mentioned Glückwalders, Dussler, Budensieck, Hermann Fiore, and of course Oberhuber. The St. Margaret at the Louvre is mentioned by Vasari not in the life of Raphael, but in that of Giulio, who would have painted it nearly entirely after the design by the master. The Vienna St. Margaret doesn't figure in any of Vasari's editions. However, as we know, the Venetian nobleman and great connoisseur of art, Marcantonio Michel, to whom we owe most of our knowledge of paintings by Giorgione, Titian, Palma, and many others in Venetian possessions, reports in his account of the artworks found in 1528 in the house of Messer Juan Antonio Venier. And he says, la tela della Santa Margarita poco menor del naturale fu de man de Raphael de Urbino che la fece a Don, no name, abate de San Benedetto, che la donò a Messer Juan Antonio. And then follows a very beautiful, straight description of it. If it's true that Michel was in Rome at the time of Raphael's death, as Cheryl Rees also mentioned yesterday in her talk, he surely must have been informed about Raphael's artistic output, particularly in relation to paintings in Venetian collections. That he didn't give the name of the abbot who commissioned it remains puzzling, and even so John Sherman did much to find out more. We are still in the dark, since we don't even know the location of the Benedictine monastery. Very important is the indication that Juan Antonio Venier gave his services as a notary and advocate to the Benedictines between 1518 and 30, among them to those of Santa Giustina in Padua, as well as San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. As Paul Holberton had suggested, Venier's son, Marin, had married Laura di Andrea de Priuli in 1547, and the painting may have passed this way to the possession of the Priuli family. And finally, in 1638, Michel Priuli, procurator of St. Mark's, had to sell his possessions, particularly his valuable paintings. For a time, Hamilton's and Arundel's agents had competed with each other, and Gabriele Naudeo notified his friend Cassiano dal Pozzo that the English ambassador, meaning Basil Fielding, had paid 30,000 ducatoni and 6.000 al procuratore Priuli per una Santa Margherita di mano di Raffaello di Urbino e certe mezze figure del Giorgione. In February 38, the same ambassador Fielding wrote to the Marquis of Hamilton, the good old procurator Priuli, who lately sold your lordship the St. Margaret of Raphael, entangling his foot in his gown, fell down a pair of stairs and is since dead, which moved the whole broglio at St. Mark's to say that it was impossible he should live after he had parted with his saint. Marco Boschini, in his Carta del Navigar Pittoresco of 1660, reports that the work hung 100 years in Capriuli in a Regia stanza, and that it was the most beautiful work Raphael ever made. In his Minere della Pittura of 1664, the same author mentioned a copy of the painting in the Priuli chapel in the Camaldolese monastery of San Michele in Murano, a man sinistra dell'uscir di chiesa sotto il coro vi è l'altare di casa Priuli, e nella tavola ebbi la copia della Santa Margherita di Raffaello. L'originale fu portato in Inghilterra. This copy may have been there until the monastery was suppressed at the time of Napoleon, and we are currently trying to find out more about this, especially since the Camaldolese also obeyed the Benedictine rule. Francesco Sansovino, in his Venezia Città Nobilissima of 1571, mentions neither original nor copy, and despite the fact that the painting was not accessible to the public, Raphael's Margaret gained some fame among Venetian painters. And I'm sorry about this terrible illustration. And Titian certainly knew it when he produced his paintings of St. Margaret overcoming the dragon in a beautiful landscape setting, which must have been inspired by Raphael's work. And when Titian's most famous St. Margaret, the Prado version, arrived in Vienna for the late Titian show in 2007, I could not resist putting St. Raphael's Margaret next to it. The Vienna St. Margaret passed together with the collections of Bartolomeo della Nave and Nicolas Régnier into the possession of the Marquis of Hamilton, who himself might have acted as an agent for King Charles I. But as we all know, the overthrow of the monarchy and the beheading of the king and his entourage led to the sale of the English collections to the continent, and Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, the governor of the Netherlands, who had acquired the Hamilton collection, had himself painted, surrounded by his new treasures. And in the innumerable gallery paintings done by David 10 years the younger, which the Archduke proudly sent to the courts in Vienna, and you have the version here in Madrid and other places, St. Margaret always figures prominently. Despite the opulence of the Venetian paintings within this collection, the Giorgiones, Titians, Palmas, Lottos, Veroneses, it is always St. Margaret that is singled out as the masterpiece by way of a piece of cloth thrown over it, once blue, another time red. Raphael's St. Margaret remained one of the highlights when the Archduke's collection merged with the imperial collection and was included in the new presentation done at the order of Emperor Charles VI between 1720 and 33 at the Stallburg in Vienna. And maybe it was its fame which spared it from the brutal alterations in format by way of trimming and the like, which other paintings suffered to make them fit into the decorative schemes of the setting. Oops, here you have 10 years copy, and then you have Prodromus's, just to show that it was always prominently regarded in the imperial collection. Of course, Michel was wrong to state that the painting was on canvas, but he was wrong at other times, and it seemed that sort of paint carriers were not his specialty. And it is still on its original wooden support. The boards were thin to about 5 to 6 millimeters in strength with the cradle. And it is typical of the bias of the Viennese collection for Venetian art that we simply have no documentation of earlier restorations of the painting, only from some detailed photos done in the course of the last restoration between 1981 and 84. You can see from the fill-ins, the damages along the boards, the losses of paint caused by many little blisters and cuppings in specific areas, particularly in St. Margaret's right arm. Still, the painting is, of course, in much better condition than its sister in the Louvre, with its excessive losses of the paint surface due to repeated transfers over time. The story of the saint's encounter with the dragon is told in the Vitae Sanctorum and in Jacopo da Voragines' more popular Golden Legend. And while in the legends, the martyr's encounter with the dragon takes place in prison and not in a landscape, artists took poetic licenses. Marcantonio Raimondi had earlier created a print of St. Margaret with the dragon in a rocky landscape, and in it we see how Margaret successfully turns the dragon into a pet through the sign of the cross. It has been argued that the Louvre St. Margaret would allude to the apocryphal story according to which the saint was devoured by the dragon. When she made the sign of the cross, the dragon's body burst open and the saint stepped out unharmed. In her hand she holds the martyr's palm. Oops. The Vienna St. Margaret triumphantly lifts the crucifix in her left hand, and we see its rod broken at the lower end. What has not been noticed so far is the broken shaft in the body of the dragon on the right beneath the crucifix. Rather than thinking St. Margaret could have used the cross as a weapon, like a spear, like St. George, it might refer to the story according to which she had made herself a wooden crucifix before she was devoured, and this grew so big in the belly of the dragon that it split it open. Antique sculpture has been suggested to have inspired both works. For stance and dress of the Vienna St. Margaret, Budensiek had suggested the dressed Aphrodite of Milos in the Vatican collections as a possible model. Even so, Margaret doesn't wear the peplos over her hip, and we have just seen previously examples of similar antique prototypes. The same antique prototype served as model for Lorenzetto's Madonna del Sasso, which was to adorn Raphael's tomb in the Pantheon, and this strengthened Budensiek's conviction that the Vienna painting was autograph. For the Paris version, Hermann Fiori pointed to an antique statue of Nike in the Archaeological Museum in Naples, particularly in regard to the flow of the garments. That these antique victories were consciously employed as the appropriate models for their Christian counterparts, it's not surprising, since Margaret is shown in both versions victorious, if not triumphant, over the evil. But the two St. Margarets couldn't be more different from one another in expression and mood, while the Louvre version breathes more of a Christian spirit, which was probably more important to the Pope as a donator than to the Christianissimus Rex, who was to receive it. The Vienna St. Margaret appears in her stance and dress, and particularly in this wet garment with the nipple protruding, more sensuous, and we cannot exclude that the abbot donated it to the Ardent Art Collection, in part also for this reason, because it may have been too sensuous for the abbey. Except for Gustav Glück, most scholars argue that the Vienna painting was invented later than the Louvre version. However, I do agree with Glück that invention and execution should be separated. In this case, I consider the invention particularly close to the composition of Saint Michael defeating the devil, preserved in a copy drawing in Oslo after an earlier design by Raphael for the Saint Michael in the Louvre, which is datable to about 1516. Both share the compactness in type and action. We find the same self-contained contrapposto and the insistence on the columnar solidity, elements which point to an earlier date for the invention of both in relation to the more daring and spacious movements in both of the saints in the Louvre. And it was not uncommon for Raphael to start out with an iconographically rather traditional model from which he would search for new expressive solutions. There is a related drawing in the Tylers Museum considered autograph and preparatory by Oberhuber, but a copy work of an anonymous artist by Henry and Ioannidis. Even so, there are changes between the painting and the drawing, the smaller size of the animal in relation to the saint. She's holding a simple cross, not the crucified on it. She appears slimmer and taller than the painted version. It does not appear to be preparatory to me. And at its present, it does not link I believe, was the underdrawing of the painting visible in infrared reflectography either. I show you here some of the details of the underdrawing found in, and I hope you can see it, yeah, found in the reflectography, and I shall move on. What is most surprising about them is that they are not kalki. They are not mechanical, but throughout freehand. They are precise and purposeful, but on the whole done in a kind of calm and secure stroke. In Giulio's underdrawings, we have not found anything comparable so far. But even a comparison with Giulio's more securely attributed painting, oh no, these are the more mechanical drawings which are also attributed to Giulio for the Transfiguration at the Prado. And I just see no possible way of comparing the two. But even a comparison with Giulio's more securely attributed with Giulio's more attributed paintings shows a greater ease, control, and simpleness. It lacks the busy artificiality Even so, it is not my intention here to convince you that the painting is autograph Raphael in invention and execution, as Konrad Oberhuber suggested when he brought in the notion that Raphael himself employed different modes of execution, a more labored and precious one, but also a more summary and cheap one, always depending on his relationships to his patron. But I would like you to think about a possible alternative to Giulio.
Sylvia, thank you.